we're seeing a lot more of this.
50 children were found to be working graveyard shifts.
2 10-year-olds work for free at a McDonald's.
14 states have introduced legislation to loosen child labor laws.
But to understand why we seem to have a child labor problem in this country, we have to look at our history. When did it start? Why was it so common? What did it actually look like? And how we cracked down on it. Any story about when child labor began in this country starts before we were a country. In Britain, poor children almost always started work as soon as their parents could find employment for them. The same was true in colonial America. This usually took 3 forms: helping out around the house or family farm, indentured servitude to a tradesperson, often by children of immigrants, or the children of slaves who were made to work alongside their parents. The biggest sector, by far, was family farms. From the early 1600s until 1776, 90% of all Americans worked on a farm. Most of this was subsistence farming, so naturally kids went to work on their family farms to help feed the family. Even after the Revolutionary War, all the way up until the 1940s, the majority of Americans worked in farming, so it's no wonder that this was also where the majority of child labor occurred. This also helps explain why agriculture still has some of the biggest problems with child labor, which we'll get back to in a bit. But it was the Industrial Revolution that dramatically changed how many kids worked and what that work looked like. There's a lot of factors for why it grew so much during this time period. For one, machines made work less complex, which meant children could be productive even with rudimentary skills. For another, there were just a lot more jobs that needed doing in cities now. But a big part of the story comes down to how children were thought about back then. They were seen more as economic assets and less as innocent kids who should be protected. Especially in New England, the Puritan work ethic was a dominant social and political ideal. Idleness was not only undesirable, but sinful. But the biggest predictor of child labor was poverty.
Child labor has never been a problem of the wealthy. Economic necessity often compelled poor families to send one or more of the children to the labor force, even amongst poor families that valued education.
So you have a complex brew of industrialization, economic growth, political and religious beliefs about kids, and widespread economic inequality that drives more and more kids to work. So much so that between 1890 and 1910, no less than 18% of all children ages 10 to 15 worked. So what did that work actually look like? For most kids, it was work on their family farm. For other children, it was home-based work, things like florists, seamstresses, things that help moms supplement the income of dad. In cities, it was often the street trades, newspaper boys, shoe shines, messengers, things like that. But all sorts of light manufacturing employed children. You saw this a lot in glass bottle manufacturing, but less so in sheet glass. The heavier the industrial process, the fewer kids you'd see working in it. But one of the biggest employers of children was the textile industry. In 1900, 25,000 of the nearly 100,000 textile workers in the South were children younger than 16. By 1904, that had increased to 50,000, with 20,000 of those children being under 12. It was the work of the glass bottle makers, coal miners, and textile workers that really changed the conversation around child labor, though. The conditions were often brutal, and the photos of children performing these jobs made the conditions impossible to ignore. So it's the mid-19-teens, and progressive groups like the National Child Labor Committee start agitating for national legislation to outlaw child labor. Congress enacted a bill in 1916 and then another in 1919 to crack down, but both were overturned at the Supreme Court. In the same time period, though, economic inequality was on the decline, which meant more and more parents could afford to send their kids to school. Then in the 1930s, the Great Depression basically ended industrial child labor because so many adults were out of work or would work for really low wages that employers didn't really need to hire kids. Then finally came the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938, which established minimum wages, maximum hours, and restrictions on child labor.
The irony is, by 1938, Child labor in the mines, mills, and factories was history. The reform movement created enough sense of moral outrage that it was effectively abolished.
Now, as you're seeing today, this didn't end child labor once and for all in this country. It just put limits on the type of work kids could do, aka no more factories or mines, how many hours kids could work, etc. But the FLSA didn't solve everything. Agriculture has always been our biggest problem when it comes to child labor, partly because farming wasn't included in the original bill. It wasn't even covered until 1974, but even then, the standards were way weaker than any other industry.
How old are you? 12. How old are you? 9.
Which is partly why today, as many as 500,000 children harvest 25% of the food we eat in this country. In 1938, it might have made sense to exclude agriculture from the FLSA because family farms needed their kids to work on them. Today, though, small family farms produce less than 3% of our food. On those industrial farms, 68% of all agricultural labor is performed by immigrants or their children, often in sweltering heat with consistent exposure to pesticides. But child labor has been on the rise across industries. The federal government reported a 69% increase in child labor violations in recent years. Making matters worse, the deteriorating economic conditions in Central America have driven a huge influx of unaccompanied minors into the U.S. More than 260,000 kids have come here in the last 2 years, many of whom are looking for work or being forced to. In spite of all that, 14 states have made moves to loosen the restrictions on child labor, partly because many employers claim they're struggling to find people willing to work for them.
We used to have stacks of applications. Now we might have 2 or 3.
Now, numerous groups have come out against these proposed changes in state laws, which sets up a new chapter in a centuries-long fight.
I thought it was a settled question. What's even more troubling on top of that is I'm not sure we're seeing sufficient moral outrage about the resurgence of child labor.